Welcome back. This is part 2 of our conversation about the book of Numbers. Now, if you haven't watched part 1 yet, be sure to do that first. In that first episode, we learned a new reading technique that helped us spot connections to Genesis 1 through 9 in Numbers. We practiced on only the first few chapters of Movement 1, and we saw how God was shaping Israel into a new Eden. Now, today, we'll keep practicing this way of reading and uncover what God is doing in the second and third movements of Numbers. So let's get started. Movement 2 goes from Numbers chapter 11 to chapter 25. And in this movement, it's important to remember how God arranged Israel's camp to look like Eden. Remember those 3 concentric circles? At the center of their camp was the tabernacle, where God's presence dwelled. And around that were the Levites, tasked with working and keeping it. And around them was an outer ring made up of the 12 tribes. And this mirrored the layout of Eden. The tree of life at the center, the garden Adam and Eve worked and kept, and then the broader land of Eden beyond all of that. Now, those 3 circles will be very important to understanding the second movement of Numbers. Every circle of Israel is about to be tested. In fact, there are 7 testing stories in this second movement. We're only going to look at 3 of those, paying attention to which circle is being tested. So let's look at the test that's found in Numbers 13 to 15. Moses sends 12 spies, leaders from each tribe, to scout the land that God is giving them. And he instructs them to see whether the land is good or bad, and bring back some of its fruit. Now, this echoes Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve saw that the fruit of the tree was good. The spies return with good fruit and bad news. 10 of the spies report that the land is too dangerous for Israel to live in. The descendants of the Nephilim, those rebellious warriors, are already living in the land. Do you hear the echoes of Genesis here? There was already a rebellious creature living in the garden when Adam and Eve arrived there too. That creature led Adam and Eve to distrust God. Now, 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, are unafraid, and they're urging Israel to trust God. They are confident that God's presence and protection will go with them into the new land. The tribes of Israel are facing a test here. A test is an opportunity to trust God or to go our own way. Israel fails this test, refusing to enter the land that God has provided. When Adam and Eve failed their test, they were exiled from Eden and sent into the wilderness. Now, what happens when Israel fails theirs? The spies scouted the land for 40 days, and now Israel will spend 40 years outside the land, living in the wilderness until their entire rebellious generation dies off, except for Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua. And we hear the familiar melody of the Genesis flood, when the rebels perished in the 40-day downpour, but a righteous remnant was preserved to enter a new land of abundance. So in this story, the outer circle of Israel was tested, the 12 tribes. When they failed their test, God responded with both justice and mercy. Now let's look at a second test, paying attention to which circle it's affecting. Now, this test is found in Numbers 16 through 19. There's a group of Levites that are serving as the property management team for the tabernacle, and they want to be high priests instead. They unleash on Aaron and Moses, even though it was God who gave them their important role and who chose Aaron as high priest. This is a test, an opportunity to trust God or to go their own way. Do you hear any notes from Genesis 1 through 9? I hear Genesis 4, when God favored Abel over his brother Cain, and jealousy festered into rebellion. So read the rest of the story yourself to find out how God responds. Listen for a few more echoes of the Cain and Abel story and the purifying flood. What is the ground doing in this story? What sign does God give as a reminder of his justice and mercy? Listen closely. Now, the first test was for the outer ring of Israel, the 12 tribes, but this second test was for the middle circle of Israel, the Levites. So who do we expect to be tested next? The next test comes in Numbers chapter 20. Israel has been in the wilderness for 38 years. Nearly every rebel has died off. It's almost time to enter the promised land. But there's a problem. There's no water. People are tired of eating manna and quail. And so they're turning on Moses, just as their parents and grandparents did so many years before. God gives Moses clear instructions to take his staff, gather the people in front of a rock, speak to that rock, and then God will provide water. So Moses takes his staff, just as God instructed, gathers the people, just as God instructed. But then, instead of speaking to the rock as God instructed, he speaks to the people. He chastises them and takes credit for the miracle that God is about to perform. Then Moses strikes the rock twice with his staff, and water comes gushing out, enough for all the people and their animals. This is a test of the innermost circle. Moses is the man who meets with God face to face inside the tabernacle at the very center of the camp. Moses fails to trust God's instructions and chooses to go his own way. And God responds with justice and mercy. Moses won't be allowed to lead Israel into the new land, but God mercifully spares his life and provides for him in the wilderness. In the beginning, God's commands brought life to a wilderness, transforming it into a garden. And when Adam and Eve failed to follow God's command there, their lives were spared, but they were sentenced to life in the wilderness. But even there, God mercifully provided for them. So in the first movement of Numbers, God recreated Israel to be a new Eden. In the second movement, the new Eden is tested and fails at every level, receiving God's justice and mercy. Now, as you read the rest of this movement on your own, look for the connections to Genesis 1 through 9 and this pattern of testing, failure, justice, and mercy. Now let's look at a small sample of movement 3 of Numbers together. Now in the third movement of Numbers, chapters 26 to 36, Israel is at the border of the new land. They're preparing to cross the Jordan into that Eden-like abundance on the west side. It begins with a census in Numbers 26, pointing once again to God's blessing of humanity to be fruitful and multiply back in Genesis 1. Then in Numbers 27, verses 1 to 11, we meet the daughters of Zelophehad. Someone has got to start an all-woman band called the Daughters of Zelophehad, and I definitely want a t-shirt. So their father died in the wilderness with the rebel generation, and he had no sons. So these daughters ask Moses if they can inherit their father's portion of the promised land. Look at their faith. I mean, they're certain that God is about to give Israel a good land, and they want a piece of it. Now, this has been debated, but some scholars hear notes from Genesis 1 in this story. Remember, God created men and women to be his image, to rule and subdue the world together. By granting the daughter's request, God restores an important part of Eden's original design. Men and women representing God together in a land of abundance. Then in Numbers 27, verses 12 to 23, God meets with Moses on a mountain overlooking the promised land that he can't enter. These verses are full of references to Genesis 1 and 2, but we're just going to look at a couple. Moses calls God the God who gives breath to all flesh, which takes us back to God breathing life into Adam's flesh. Moses asked God to appoint a new leader who will rule Israel like a shepherd guides his sheep, like Adam and Eve were appointed to rule the beast on God's behalf. Now we're going to skip ahead to Numbers chapter 32, but the chapters we're skipping are also packed with more melodies from Genesis 1 through 9. So when you read them on your own, listen closely. Now let's jump to Numbers 32. As Israel is about to cross the Jordan River into the new land on the west side, 2.5 tribes refuse to go. They see the land on the east side of the Jordan and they say it's good for their flocks. Now, you recognize that music by now, right? Now, Moses is furious and he compares these tribes to the rebellious spies from Numbers 13. He warns that they're about to bring down their whole generation, just like those men did. So these tribes strike a compromise. They agree to cross over with the rest of Israel to help them settle in the new land, and then they'll return to live on the east side of the Jordan. Now, is this compromise a good thing? What does God think about it? In the book of Numbers, we don't get a clear answer. But 500 years later, we do. In 2 Kings, we read about Assyria's invasion of Israel. The first tribes to fall are the ones that stayed east of the Jordan, the ones closest to Assyria. This invasion is described as a purifying flood, a downpour of justice on God's rebellious people. But God is still committed to living with his people in Eden abundance right here on earth. So a remnant is mercifully spared, and the story continues. So today we've learned how to listen for the music of Genesis 1 through 9 as we read the book of Numbers, and this revealed what God was doing in all 3 movements of the book. In movement 1, God created Israel as a new Eden. In the second movement, every circle of this new Eden community was tested and failed, and God responded with purifying justice and merciful provision. And in the final, third movement, God once again recreated Israel to be a new Eden in a new land. God blessed Israel to be fruitful and multiply. God restored his original design for Eden, men and women ruling creation together. God provided a new and faithful shepherd to guide his people like sheep to new pastures. And God led his people away from danger and death to abundance and life. And that's the book of Numbers. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.